Alright guys, so let's go through what we're learning, why you need to learn this, and really how you'll know if you're successful at the end of the day. Alright, so what are you learning today? So students, that's you, you're going to be able to use the substitution method to solve a system of linear equations. So we started our systems of equations unit last week, we're just continuing with that. Why are you learning this? So you've already learned how to solve by graphing. Substitution is just the next method. So the good thing about systems of equations is there's different ways to solve the problem. So we're going to teach you all the different ways, and then at the end you'll just kind of pick which one you like best. So if you're a graphing person, you might go with graphing. If you're not a big graphing person, you'd rather just solve an equation, then maybe substitution, or maybe our last one, elimination, maybe those would be better for you. So the cool thing about systems of equations is you have options. So you get to kind of pick which one you like best. And then how do you know if you're going to be successful today? So when you're given a system of equations, if you can use substitution and then solve that equation, then you'll be successful. Now, since it's our first day, it might be a little rough and it might be a little tougher than what we were thinking, and that's okay. It's going to be kind of a learning day, a notes day. You have your foldable. So we're going to get started with your foldable. You should have that in front of you. And the first slide here, you do not need to write down. This is just kind of a review thing, making sure we all understand what substitution is. So don't write this down in your foldable. We're going to use all the boxes in your foldable, and this does not go in there. So let's talk about with solving a system of equations using substitution. Well, what is substitution? So in case you've forgotten, substitution is when you remove, everybody say remove, you remove part of an equation and put something new in its place. So you're taking something out of the equation and replacing it with something different. So think of it like a substitute teacher. So in me or Mr. Schrag, when we're gone, a substitute takes our place. So we're gone, they take us out, substitute comes in, takes our place. It's the same thing, only it's happening in an equation. We're taking something out, and we're going to substitute something new in its place, okay? So I'm going to move it to the next screen, and I want you guys to write everything on this screen in your top left box. So we're going to jot this down. These are our steps for solving substitution. I'm going to give you a second to write this down, then we'll go through them. Alright, so now you've had a couple minutes here to jot these down. Let's go through them. Now remember, when I stop everybody, and remember everybody means everybody, everybody's going to read the next word. If you're wondering if that includes you, it does. So everyone's going to read the next word as we go through this. I'll have it following along with my arrow on the screen. So we're all helping out here, everybody participating. So the first step is we're going to isolate A from 1. Okay, remember isolate just means we want to get it by itself. So we're going to get one of the variables by itself from one of our equations. Okay, then next we're going to substitute everything, the equal sign, into the other. Okay, so we're going to take everything that's behind our equal sign and we're going to substitute it in. So remember, substitution, we're taking something out, putting something in its place. All right, our third step. Since it's just one word, you're all going to help me out and say this on 3. Ready? 1, 2, 3. So our third step is we're going to solve that first equation that we created. Okay, then the next one, we're going to substitute your back into the equation, and we'll talk about how you know which equation's easier. We'll look at that together. Okay, and then again on 3, you're going to 1, 2, 3. So we're going to solve the equation again. So if you notice, we're solving twice. There's 2 equations we're going to solve to get our answer. And then finally, you're going to write your answers as an ordered. Okay, so it's kind of like with graphing. At the end, if you have a point where they cross, you write them as an ordered pair. Same thing here. So this is the top left box. Okay, let's look at the top right box. Okay, so there's several things you need to make sure you have before we start. So you need to make sure in your top right box that you write down where it says, when given y equals mx plus b. So one of your equations is already written in slope-intercept form. Here's what you're going to do. So I'm going to give you a second to write this down, and then we'll go through it. Okay, so now that you've had a chance to write this down, let's look at it. So again, we said this box represents when they give us one of our equations in slope-intercept form, y equals mx plus b. So if we look, our top equation is already written that way. y equals 6x minus 11. So we're good. Our second equation is not written that way, but our top one is. So let's talk about what we're doing. Remember, our first step was to isolate the variable. That was our first step. But our variable y is already isolated, so this is good. We already have y by itself, so that's awesome. So we're going to keep that there. Our second step, if you remember, was to sub everything that's behind the equal sign. So let's look. In the equation that has y by itself, we're going to go ahead and we're going to put a box around everything that's behind the equal sign. So I want everybody to do this. So you're going to put a box behind everything behind the equal sign. And we're going to sub that into our other equation. Okay? So remember, here's what you got to know. When you do this, we have y equals and then this amount that we boxed. So what that tells us is we're going to take this amount and we're going to put it where y is. So this amount that's boxed is about to get substituted in for y in our other equation. So when we do this, we're going to take that other equation and we're just going to rewrite it down below. So it says negative 2x minus 3. Now remember, we're substituting in. So we're going to put parentheses around what we're subbing in. Remember, we're subbing in the information that we boxed. So we boxed 6x minus 11. So we're substituting that in for y. Then remember, all of this is going to equal negative 7. So again, all we've done is we've taken what we boxed, so everything behind the equal sign that we boxed, we put it where y was. So instead of y, this equation says 6x minus 11. Okay? So now all we've done is instead of having an equation with two variables, two different variables, we've created an equation with one variable. Okay, so let's do this. So as we try and solve, remember, anytime we have parentheses, this is the distributive property if there's a number outside. So I'm going to give you a second. We've done this before, and I want you to go ahead and distribute that out. And I'm actually going to give you a second. I want you to see if you can work this all the way out and figure out what x equals. So go ahead and solve this out. I'm going to give you a second here. Alright, so let's see how we did. So we still have negative 2x, so that just gets brought down. Nothing happened there. But we had some distributing to do. So we have negative 3. So hopefully when you distribute, you remember this is a negative 3. Negative 3 times positive 6 gives me negative 18x. Okay. And then negative 3 times negative 11 gives me positive 33. And I haven't done anything with my negative 7. That's over on the right side. Okay. So as I start to look, there are some things I can combine. I see that on the right or on the left side, I have some coefficients and variables that I can combine. So negative 2x minus 18 more x gives me negative 20x. Okay, so I have negative 20x plus 33 equals negative 7. And then I know that I need to get x by itself, so that tells me that my constants, so this positive 33, is going to have to move to the other side. So the inverse of plus, or addition, so you guys help me, what's the inverse of addition? So I'm going to subtract 33 to my right side, and those cancel out. Now if I have negative 7 and I subtract 33 more, I'm getting a big old negative. I'm basically adding these together and keeping the negative sign. That's going to be negative 40, and that leaves me with negative 20x equals negative 40. And we all know that if it's negative 20 next to x, that's multiplication. So everybody help me out. The inverse of multiply is? So I know my last step here is I'm going to divide both sides by negative 20 to get my final answer. So that one's gone. And x equals, on 3, you're going to tell me what x equals. Ready? 1, 2, 3. All right, and we should have gotten positive 2 for our answer. Okay, so normally when we solve an equation, we get to stop right here. But if you check the top left box in your foldable, we're really only kind of halfway. We've done the first solving. So the next step we have to do is substitute our answer into the easier equation. So let's look at our two equations that we have up here. If we go back up to the top, my top equation has y by itself, a 6x, and a negative 11 or minus 11. Now our second equation has negative 2x, negative 3y, and negative 7. So a lot of negative numbers. I have to decide, could I put this 2, should I put it for x in the first equation or in the second equation? I have to decide which one would be easier. Well, since y is already by itself, and we kind of want to avoid all these negatives, that seems like a lot of work, we're going to take this 2 and we're going to put it back into the top equation. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to draw an arrow to help you out here. So you're going to have an arrow that goes all the way up here and tells you you're going to put it back into the first equation. Okay? So some of us don't like to show our work. For these problems, you're going to have to show your work. You're going to have to make sure you show everything, because otherwise it can get a little jumbled and confused. So we're going to take that equation now and rewrite it over to the side. So we have y equals 6, but remember, we know what x is. We just found x down at the bottom. So one more time, everybody, remind me, what was x equal to? So since x was 2, we're going to take that 2 and we're going to put it in for x. So instead of 6x, we have 6 times 2 minus 11. Okay? So let's go ahead and work this one out. I'm going to give you a second. Go ahead and tell me you're going to solve this for y equals something. You tell me that. All right, go ahead and work. All right, so we know that 6 times 2 is 12, and we just have to do 12 minus 11, so on 3. Everybody help me out. Y equals, ready? 1, 2, 3. And we should have had positive 1. So now we have done everything except for the very last step. So our last step is the ordered pair. Remember, in an ordered pair, it goes x first and then y. So for us, our x value down here was 2. So ours is going to say positive 2. And our y value up at the top was positive 1. So our y value is positive 1. And we know from our graphing experience that if they cross and make a point, that's an example of one solution. So let's go ahead and write that out. And there's our final answer. So it does seem like a lot. I know it's a lot of steps, but we'll get the hang of it. Okay? So there's our first type that I wanted you to see. The next thing I want you to do is go down to the bottom left box. So here's the bottom left box. So I want you to think about this equation. I'm going to give you a second to talk it over with your table partner. How are these two equations a little different from the one we just saw? Okay, so you're going to write this down, give you time to write and discuss. Okay, go ahead and go. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to talk. So up at the top, it kind of gave you a little hint. This says when solving for y. So if we look at this, neither one of these equations have y by itself. But we've been practicing a lot lately getting y by itself. So when y is not by itself, that gives us the first step of isolating the variable. Now what's cool about this is we get to pick which one we want to use. So let's think about this. In our first equation, we have negative 5x, and y is already on the left side, which is good. And there's no coefficient. There's no number there. Okay? On our second equation, we have 3x. Then we also have this negative 8 here. So there's a couple things we would have to move. So that tells us that this first equation is the one that we want to rearrange first. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to take this first equation and we're just going to drop it down here. And we're going to rewrite it. So it's going to say negative 5x plus y equals negative 3. So you're going to convert this into slope-intercept form. You're going to move that negative 5x to the other side. Go ahead and do that. All right, let's see how we did. So to get negative 5 across the equal sign, everybody, what's the inverse of negative? So we got to add 5x over here to the right side. So this 5x is gone. So we end up with y equals negative 3 plus 5x. Now again, we need that x in the coefficient to be first. So we're going to take this positive 5x and we're going to move it in front. And we end up with y equals 5x minus 3. Okay, so we're going to take what we know y equals and we're going to substitute it back into an equation. So that is our second step. We're substituting this in. So we're going to take this equation up here, the second one, 3x, we're just going to drop it down below so we have some room to work. So remember, since it's everything behind the equal sign, so that's 5x minus 3, remember that equals y. So we're taking the y value out, we're putting 5x minus 3 in its place. So we have 3x minus 8, but instead of y, here's where our parentheses come in, and we're going to drop down everything that we boxed. So we boxed 5x minus 3. We're going to put that in where the y was. Again, that's because it says y equals. That's going to equal 24. Okay, so I'm going to give you a second. I want you to go ahead and distribute this negative 8, and I want you to get your answer for x. Okay, ready, go. All right, so let's see how we did. So 3x stays 3x. Then I had negative 8 times 5. So you guys help me out. What's negative 8 times 5? Should have been negative 40x. One more time, what's negative 8 times negative 3? And that should have been positive 24. And that's going to equal 24 on this side. Okay? So we have 3x minus 40x plus 24 equals 24. So we have a lot going on here. So as we look at this, let's start by combining our variables. So we're going to start by combining 3x and negative 40x. So 3x minus 40x should have given us negative 37x. So that's a lot of x's, but it's negative. And we're just going to drop down the plus 24 and the plus 24, the positive 24. Okay, so we're here and here. Okay, so we now know that we got to get rid of everything to have x by itself. So let's start with our positive 24. So we should have moved that to the other side. Everybody help me. The inverse of positive 24 is... So we had to subtract 24 from both sides. So our left side cancels out, and then we're left with something weird on the right side, because we know, everybody, what's 24 minus 24? And that should be 0. So we have 0 on our right side. But we still have negative 37x on our left side. So it's starting to look weird, because normally we would divide. So we would divide by negative 37. But we know that you can't divide 0. You can't split 0 into 37 parts. So that kind of gives it away that x should be a certain number. So you're going to tell me on 3 what x was. Ready? 1, 2, 3. And x should have been 0. So our x value is 0. So we have just finished the third step, which was solve. Our next step is to sub the answer into the easier equation. So let's check out our two equations one more time. Remember, we have x, so we're going to be trying to figure out what y is. So up here at the top, we have negative 5x plus y equals negative 3, which helps us. Remember, we discussed this earlier because y is by itself, no coefficient. We would just have to move the negative 5. Or we have the second equation, 3x minus 8y equals 24. So that means we'd have to move the 3x and the negative 8. So we're going to substitute it into our first top equation to make this a little easier. So we did this last time. I want you to do it again. You're going to draw a big arrow here from this equation all the way up to our top equation. Okay? So that tells us where we're subbing it in. And again, we're going to take that top equation and we're going to write it over to the side. Now remember, we already know that x is 0. So when we get to that x, we're not going to write x. We're going to put a 0 in its place. So it would look like this. Negative 5. And then in parentheses, 0, because that's what our x value was, plus y equals negative 3. So now we've substituted back in. The next step again is to solve. So I'm going to give you a second here. Tell me what y is. All right, so let's see how we did. Well, we know, everyone help me out, what's negative 5 times 0? Okay, and that's 0. So that kind of tells us we're done with it. And that leaves us with y equals negative 3. So now I have my two values. I had x equals 0 and y equals negative 3. And I'm ready to write my ordered pair. Remember, in the ordered pair, it goes x first, then y. So my x value comes first, which was 0, comma, negative 3, because that's my y value. So that means that if I graph these two equations on a graph, they would cross each other at over 0, down 3. So this was, again, if they cross each other, if we can get a point, that's still a one solution answer. So our answer is 0, 3, one solution. Okay, you guys are doing great. I know these are a lot of steps. Let's move to our last box. Here's where it kind of switches up just a little bit. So let's go to the last box. All right, so let's talk about when solving for x. So this one's just a little bit different. I know it's kind of cut off, and I apologize. But this is when solving for x. So normally, we try and write it as y equals something. But sometimes it's just a lot easier to use x equals something, and you can do that. So if we look at our two equations here, you have negative 7x minus 2y equals negative 13 at the top equation, and we have x minus 2y equals 11. So if we notice, x is kind of by itself. There's no coefficient. So it would be really easy to get x all alone. We would just have to move the negative 2y. So sometimes it's actually easier to get x by itself than it is to get y by itself. And that's what we're going to do here. Remember, I've told you with systems of equations, you have kind of a lot of choices you can make. So you can choose which equation, you can choose what you want to solve for. Well, in this case, we're going to solve for x. So let's think about this. From what we know, to get x by itself, negative 2y has to jump to the other side. Okay? So let's do that. Help me out here. What's the inverse of minus 2y? Good, we're going to add 2y. So we know that x equals, and we're going to add 2y over here to the other side, plus 2y, and that just cancels it out over here. So x is going to equal 11 plus 2y. Now the good thing about solving for x is once you move it, you can kind of leave it alone. There's no slope-intercept form for this because it's not y equals. So this is actually where we're going to stop. So our first step, which is isolate the variable, we're done with that. The second step, sub everything behind the equal sign, that's what we're ready for. So we're going to take everything that's behind the equal sign, okay, so everything behind the equal sign here, and we're going to sub that in. Now this one's a little different because we solved for x. So when we get to the x in the first equation, we're going to put 11 plus 2y. So we're taking this first equation, and we're just going to drop it down below and start solving. So this, again, would be our third step. So we have negative 7. We're just writing it just like it looks. But instead of x, we have 11 plus 2y. And again, we got that from what we boxed. Minus 2y equals negative 13. And that's just coming straight from that second equation. Okay? So this one's a little bit longer, but we can still do this. So I'm going to give you a second. I want you to solve for y. So we're going to distribute that negative 7 and see what we get for our y value. Okay, ready, go. All right, so let's see how we did. So help me out here. What's negative 7 times 11? We should have got negative 77. What's negative 7 times positive 2y? That's negative 14y minus 2y, and that's going to equal negative 13. So we should have got to this point. So the next thing we could do is combine our y values. So if I'm at negative 14y and I subtract 2 more y, help me out. Negative 14 minus 2, where would I stop at? And we should have gotten negative 16y. So we have negative 77 minus 16y equals negative 13. Okay, so now we're ready to move some things. So we should have moved negative 77 over to the right side. So the inverse of negative 77 is positive 77. So we're going to add 77 to our right side. Remember, when you're adding a positive and a negative, you really subtract them. So it's really 77 minus 13, which should have given us positive 64. So we're at positive 64. So that leaves me with negative 16y equals positive 64. After that, we got to divide both sides by negative 16. So we got to be careful with our signs here. If I have a positive divided by a negative, that should give me a negative answer. So on 3, we're going to say how many times 16 goes into 64, keeping that negative sign. Ready? 1, 2, 3. And we should have said negative 4. So y equals negative 4. Okay? So we've got part of our answer down. We're like halfway through. We got that y equals negative 4. Now remember, we're to the step that says sub your answer back into the easier equation. So we're trying to get, since we have y already, we're trying to find x. So let's look up here at our two equations, and let's try and decide which one's easier. So we have negative 7x minus 2y equals negative 13, and we have x minus 2y equals 11. So we're getting pretty close. Now here's the other cool thing that can happen with systems of equations. If you remember, we made a new equation from our second one. We made x equals 11 plus 2y. So really we have three options. We have the top option, we have the original second option, and then we have our third option that we created when we move things around. Well, remember, we want to get x by itself. We're trying to figure out what x is because we already know what y is. So our third option that we already created already has x by itself. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to use the third option on this one. So we're going to switch it up a little bit and use the third option that we made. So when we draw our arrow up, you're going to draw it up to the equation that we made. And then an arrow out showing our work. So we've got x equals, and we're just copying down that equation we made, 11 plus 2. Now, instead of putting y, we know that y was negative 4. We got that from down below. So we're going to put a negative 4 in for y to solve this. So I'm going to give you a second. I want you to figure out what x equals. Okay, ready, go. All right, so let's see how we did. So help me out here, everybody. 2 times negative 4 is, we should have said negative 8. So I have 11 minus 8, or 11 plus negative 8, either way. And then all I have to do is just combine 11 minus 8. So on 3, let's all say our answer for x. Ready? 1, 2, 3. And that should be positive 3. So again, we've got our two answers. We had x equals 3, and we have y equals negative 4. And we're going to write this as an ordered pair. Again, x comes first, then y. So our x value was 3. Our y value was negative 4. And this gives us a 1 solution answer. All right, so I know this was a lot to take in probably for the first day. It looks confusing, but you got all week to learn this. I have faith in you guys. We're going to practice this a lot. Great job today. Now it's time for you to practice a couple, see what we can do on our own.